Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons, but this is an Arkham Horror video too, so I don't actually know much about Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, I've never played, so I've invited one of my very best friends, Samantha, to come talk a little bit about D&D and Arkham Horror with me. Hi Samantha.
Hi Daniel. Yes, I am a Dungeons and Dragons player. I'm also an Arkham Horror, the card game player.
So we're here today to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've found to be interestingly similar between the two games. In particular, Samantha told me maybe a few years ago when she was starting to play this game that, wow, a lot of the card names in Arkham Horror seem to be lifted from D&D, especially the 5th edition.
Yes, lifted, stolen, however you want to put that.
Inspired by.
Yes, so when we started playing, I had been playing Dungeons and Dragons for a long time already, going back to 4th edition. So a lot of the names of cards did seem oddly suspicious, oddly similar to me.
So today we're going to go ahead and talk about something like what exactly do these two games have in common? Why do they share so many of these card names and powers or abilities?
Yeah, and I think that Arkham Horror and Dungeons and Dragons are both very interesting when comparing each other because they don't ask you to do a lot of the same things mechanically, but they have a lot of overlap in terms of what they're asking the player to do when playing this game. So one thing that I noticed is that both of these games are collaborative. You're playing with other players against some kind of adversary. In Dungeons and Dragons, this is represented by the game master, who necessarily you aren't playing against to beat this person, but the game master or dungeon master does run all of the monsters and create all of the scenarios in the world that you have to overcome or that challenge you as players.
In Arkham Horror, nothing. Do you wish there was a DM or game master in Arkham Horror?
I do sometimes, but not necessarily for someone to fight against, but sometimes for someone to make rulings or to allow for a little bit more of creative decision making that Arkham Horror just doesn't allow. So in Dungeons and Dragons, you can approach a problem in many different ways. You can either take it head on if you have the skills, or many times you can kind of go around it or just avoid it altogether. So party composition in Dungeons and Dragons, especially with experienced players, can be all over the place, and you can have weaknesses and gaps in your skills, and you'll be just fine. I don't think this is necessarily the case in Arkham Horror.
No, Arkham is a little bit more mechanically driven, where you spend a lot of time thinking about party composition and who's actually be playing the game, but also what's in their decks. So I think it's really interesting to see, though, that Arkham Horror does try in spirit to be something like a tabletop RPG in terms of creativity. You're just constrained a little bit more in terms of how you get to express that. So that's really kind of what this video is going to be about. We wanted to talk a little bit more about how D&D and Arkham approach these similar concepts and themes and maybe even abilities, but with differing game mechanics.
Yes, so if you're not familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, it is a D20 role-playing system. So you roll dice in order to interact with the world. Most of the time in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, that is the 20-sided dice or the D20. There are 6 other dice. You can find them in beautiful sets anywhere you look online. But in Arkham Horror, of course, you're interacting with the world through the Chaos Bag and through Mythos.
And cards.
And cards.
It is a card game after all. Okay, so let's explore these ideas through the actual cards in Arkham Horror, the card game, and maybe what inspired them. Just to constrain ourselves a little bit, there's a whole lot more we could talk about, and maybe we will in the future. But we're just going to take a look at some actual spells in D&D 5th edition and their corresponding, at least best that Samantha thought, cards in Arkham Horror, the card game. First off, do you want to tell us a little bit about what are spells in D&D, since I really don't know?
Yes, so spells are abilities that are available to players who can cast spells, which is a little bit circular, but you have to have the ability to cast a spell in order to cast a spell. They are limited in terms of resources also, so you have to manage resources when you are a spellcaster in Dungeons and Dragons. They are leveled, so you have level 1 through level 9 in terms of your spells, And players have spell slots, so they can cast spells from their spell slots, so they have a limited number of those. So if you are a spellcaster in Dungeons and Dragons and you're like 5th level, you might have only one 3rd level slot, and you can cast one 3rd level spell that day. You probably also have lower leveled spells which you can cast more times, but that's kind of the basic gist of it.
So in Arkham Horror, the card game, if you're not super familiar with it, you have a deck of cards. You get to choose what goes into your deck, and all the cards you'll be seeing are limited, of course, by what their level is, as well as their class. So only certain investigators can take all of them, or each of them, rather. So without further ado, here are 15 D&D spells that are also cards in Arkham Horror, the card game. On the left is always going to be a spell from D&D, and I don't know anything about this, but this is a Counterspell. Samantha, what are we looking at here?
So at the top we have the spell text, and on each of these, as we go through, we won't necessarily show all of the spell text, and you can stop and pause and read it if you'd like. So at the top we have the name of the spell, which is Counterspell. It's a 3rd level abjuration. So 3rd level is the level of the spell, as I was talking about earlier. Abjuration is the school of magic, which can matter for certain characters, but most of the time doesn't matter that much. And then it has information about how you can cast it, where you can cast it, and how quickly it takes effect.
So Samantha's going to give you like a real brief summary, and then I'll try to talk about the card in Arkham Horror, the card game.
So Counterspell is a spell that you cast when you want someone else to stop their spell. So a lot of times the way that this happens in Dungeons and Dragons is that you have an evil wizard casting a spell, and you might not know what that spell is going to be, but if the evil wizard is casting it, it's probably going to be bad. So you cast Counterspell to stop that spell in its tracks.
Okay, how about Counterspell in Arkham Horror, the card game? Hey, it has the same name, and I think the art over here that we've picked is kind of similar to the art on the card. And what this does in Arkham Horror, the card game, pretty simple. When you draw a chaos token, sometimes you get ones with symbols on them, and with these particular symbols, which is most of them, maybe something bad happens in addition to the modifier on the token during the skill test, and you just cancel the token. So no modifier, and that extra other bad thing that might happen, like placing a doom on a cultist or taking damage, that doesn't happen either. So kind of a similar idea in spirit, but really the mythos is what is making that other spell. All right, let's move on to the second one, which is Banishment.
So Banishment, this is a higher level spell than Counterspell. This is 4th level. This spell has kind of 2 parts to it. The main action of it is that you cast it on something that you want to go away. So you banish one creature from this plane of existence. Dungeons and Dragons cares a lot about planes of existence, not so much the way the Arkham Horror does. But if the creature that you're targeting when you cast the spell is native to your plane of existence, they just go away for a little bit to their own little pocket dimension, and they'll come back in a minute. But if they are native to a different plane of existence, they go back to where they came from, and as long as you can concentrate on this spell for a minute, they're not coming back, which can make Banishment really great for beings from other planes in Dungeons & Dragons.
That's cool, even though I'm not sure I understood half of it. Banish is kind of a similar idea, though. It's an evasion spell. It's an event that if you succeed, you move an enemy to any location in play, and if you succeed and one of these special symbols is revealed, that enemy is not ready during the next upkeep phase, so it doesn't get to move around again until another couple rounds. Cool. Kind of similar. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Banish the card has these 2 components as well. So it's not just make this thing go away, but also if you draw a symbol token, then it stays away. Very similar to the D&D spell.
Cool. All right, let's move on to number 3, which is Blink.
All right, Blink is a spell that you cast on yourself so that you are much harder to hit by enemies. So when you cast a Blink, you roll a d20. This is that 20-sided die, and depending on the roll, you may vanish from this plane of existence and appear in the ethereal plane. So while you're in the ethereal plane, baddies can't get you, and you're safe for that round at least, but you come back on your turn.
Okay, well, I don't think there's anything called Blink in Arkham Horror the card game quite yet, but maybe something similar is Astral Travel, another spell that comes from the Mystic class, and this basically just lets you move to any revealed location. Um, that's it. I mean, there's a little bit of a downside, as most Mystic events have. It's not like you go to your special little ethereal plane or something, but it kind of is a similar idea.
Right. It can theoretically make it harder for a monster to come out and hit you
That's
if you're
true.
not at their location anymore.
Or you move further away from a hunter enemy that's about to catch up to you. Good point. Okay, next up, number 4 is Blur. Oops, we're starting with the Arkham Horror, the card game card first. This is a spell that lets you evade enemies, and if you succeed, you get an extra action, or maybe 2, since this is the level 4 version, and it's as simple as that. It's an evasion attempt that could also use your willpower, so that's kind of good for mystics. Let's see, what about in D&D?
There's also a spell called Blur. Blur, much like Blink, is a great spell to make sure that you don't get hit by someone else. In Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, there's a thing called advantage and disadvantage, and this lets you roll, for advantage, it lets you roll 2 d20s and you can take the higher result. For disadvantage, you roll 2 d20s and take the lower result. Blur lets any creature who wants to attack you have disadvantage on that attack. So it's a great way, again, to make sure that your squishy little wizard does not take very much damage.
Yeah, and mystics in Arkham Horror, the card game, are often squishy little wizards as well. Nice picture of Safina Rousseau on the card art. All right, number 5, we have Radiant Smite. This is from the Innsmouth Conspiracy, which introduced a new token type called Bless Tokens, and this is a fight spell. So it's a way for you to do some damage to enemies, especially using your willpower. Again, kind of a mystic specialty, even though this is a Guardian card. But Guardians like Bless Tokens, so there's an element of using Bless Tokens to do extra damage.
So when I was thinking about this one, I was thinking about all the smites that paladins get in Dungeons and Dragons. So a smite is a special kind of spell that is generally restricted to paladins, though a few other classes can get them. And it just generally adds extra damage or a rider to the attack that they're already making. So I was thinking of Branding Smite being very similar to Radiant Smite because Branding Smite does radiant damage. So it does.
What is radiant damage?
So there are different damage types in Dungeons and Dragons, and radiant damage is just one of them. It's often associated with celestials and gods and clerics and, kind of religious-y stuff, but it can be really great against things like undead enemies who don't like radiant damage. It also doesn't let the creature you're attacking become invisible, which can be very nice if you're fighting something that has the tendency to go invisible.
So do you think that Sister Mary and Father Mateo, those are kind of the two characters so far that we have in Arkham Horror, the card game, that like using Radiant Smite? Are they kind of like paladins? Is that would be a class that they might be in D&D?
I don't think so. I think they'd be more like a cleric class. Clerics can definitely do some damage, but a lot of times they're more focused on buffing the party and healing the party, which I think both Sister Mary and Father Mateo are very good at. I think that a paladin would be more like a guardian who likes bless tokens, because paladins are often hard hitters, frontliners, and they are taking the damage so that your squishy little wizard doesn't.
Okay, so maybe Zoe, or the new Parallel Zoe that really likes bless tokens.
I think Parallel Zoe is a great example. I think if Parallel Zoe were in Dungeons and Dragons, she would be a paladin.
Cool. All right, let's move on to the next one, which is from Edge of the Earth, as the other multi-class spell we saw earlier, Blur was, and this one is Divination. This is an investigation spell, so in Arkham Horror, the card game, you use investigation to pick up clues. That's basically the main objective of most of the scenarios, and this lets your mystic pick up a lot of clues. And Divination, it's a great name for it. D&D also has Divination.
Also has Divination. Not only is Divination a spell, but Divination is also a school of magic. So appropriately, Divination, the spell, is from the Divination School of Magic. Dungeons and Dragons doesn't care so much about clues as a mechanic, but a lot of times you are trying to solve a mystery and follow a trail of breadcrumbs to the monster in the cave or the corrupt official in the town, something like that. So divination is a way to get more information to follow those breadcrumbs to know where you want to go. Divination specifically in Dungeons and Dragons has you talk with your god, and you can ask a question concerning a goal, event, or activity, and the Dungeon Master has to tell you the truth. But the Dungeon Master doesn't have to tell you it in a necessarily coherent way. They can give you a cryptic phrase or a rhyme or an omen. When I've been the Dungeon Master before and I've had characters cast divination, sometimes I will say, you close your eyes and you imagine something, and then I kind of describe the scenario and they pick up from that whatever they want to.
That sounds cool. All right, let's move on to the next one, which is Empower Self. This is a myriad card in Arkham Horror the card game, meaning you get 3 of these, and there's actually 3 different ones. This one is Alacrity. It basically all it does is it lets you use one of your other stats, not your willpower, in order to kind of be better at one of those other stats. So in this case, this is Agility, and when you use Empower Self itself, you get extra skill bonus when you take Agility skill tests. So there's also one for combat and one for intellect.
And this is pretty similar to the spell Enhanced Ability. Like Empower Self, there are multiple ways that you can cast this, or multiple versions of this. So when you cast the spell, you get to choose one of 6 options, and each of these 6 options is for each of the 6 stats in Dungeons and Dragons. So you can choose Dexterity, which helps you become faster and more evasive. This version is called Cat's Grace, very similar to the Alacrity version of Empower Self, which targets the Agility skill.
Moving on, number 8, back to D&D first.
Yeah, so this is a really high level spell. This is a 9th level spell, Foresight. What Foresight lets you do, at least in the flavor text, is it lets you see just a little bit into the future. And this can affect all of your attack rolls, all of your ability checks, and all of your saving throws. Basically anything that you are throwing a d20 for, you now have advantage on that throw. So it can be really powerful if you cast it on a rogue who uses that advantage to get extra damage. So Foresight can be a really great way to enhance another player in your game.
What's the hummingbird feather?
What? Oh, that's a material component for casting the spell. So you have to have that component in order to cast that spell. It's another resource that is required. For some classes, this isn't really important because you use an arcane focus and that replaces material components. But sometimes you have a component bag, and some players and dungeon masters care a lot about making sure you have all those components. So you have to go buy that hummingbird feather to be able to cast this spell.
Okay, what about Foresight in Arkham Horror the card game? It's an event that you play when you would draw a card from your deck or from the encounter deck, and if you guess correctly, if you know exactly what's coming, then you get to either cancel that card's effects or you can play that card at -2 cost. It's a little different, I think, in that it's just basically foreknowledge of what's coming from your own deck or the encounter deck, which is kind of like future events, I suppose, happening to you. Really nice for getting rid of nasty weaknesses or a treachery that you know is coming up in the encounter deck. Really good for Gloria Goldberg and Norman Withers, who both kind of play around with some foreknowledge as well.
But I think both the spell and the card deal with the same idea of what happens if we look just a little bit into the future. And the way that that is represented differs in the different games because the mechanics for those games are different. So in Dungeons and Dragons, that lets you have a better chance at doing all the things that you need to do: attack rolls, ability checks, saving throws. And in Arkham Horror, it lets you avoid some of the nasty things that are coming your way.
It's a little bit like the other card that's differently named called Premonition, where that kind of lets you see what the next token that you're going to draw is. But it has a different name, so it didn't make it onto our list. But do you agree that the ability is a little bit more similar to Foresight in D&D?
I think so. It's that ability to look just a little bit into the future and be able to use that future knowledge to your advantage.
All right. Number 9 is Augury.
So Augury is another fun spell, another divination spell, where you are trying to get information from your dungeon master about the world. It's been my experience that most of the time you get mixed results because the dungeon master doesn't necessarily know what's coming down the pipe. So for at least my group of players, casting Augury is often a little bit of a joke because we know that the Dungeon Master is just going to tell us that both good and bad results are coming.
Okay, what about in Arkham Horror? We have Augur. Augur is a cat.
Doesn't quite do the same thing, but
No.
has a very similar name.
No, but the previous card that we just looked at, Foresight, had the Augury trait, which does kind of fit in with what we were talking about. Anyway, moving on.
The next spell is the spell Geas. That's right, it's pronounced Geas, not Geas or Geas or any other various pronunciations. Geas is an Irish word. It comes from Irish mythology, and it means a vow or an injunction. So in Dungeons and Dragons, Geas is a spell that lets you tell someone else what to do, and they have to take that action or they take a lot of damage if they don't take that action.
In Arkham Horror, there's a card called Geas as well, and it's a pact traded card, so that's kind of maybe the idea of making a promise. Or and there's actually a promise you're supposed to make when you play this card. You're supposed to tell everyone that you're not going to either draw, play, or commit any cards during your turn. And if you break this promise, then you get rid of it and add a bunch of curse tokens. While it's in play, though, you get all of these boosts to your skills, and that's really good. Kind of a fun card, and I don't think anyone knows what Geas is. There's just a picture of a bird here. So do you think these are at all similar?
I think they're very similar. This idea that there is a promise that has to be made or a promise that has to be kept, and if that promise is broken, then there are bad effects coming. So in Dungeons and Dragons, it's in the form of damage, and in Arkham Horror, it's in the form of all of these curse tokens being added to the Chaos bag.
Yep. And it's kind of interesting in Arkham Horror, you really have to keep yourself honest and remember this promise. Does this ever kind of come up when you deal with Geas in D&D?
Well, usually when I've seen Geas cast, it's not against any player characters, it's against monsters or bad guys. So I have never had to deal with it as a dungeon master, but I've had dungeon masters who've had to deal with it cast by me or a party member. So they just have to keep track of it.
Exactly. Okay. Number 11 on our list is Haste, and this is a ritual. It's not exactly a spell, but kind of close to it. And this lets you take extra actions, basically. If you do the same thing twice, you get to do it again a third time. Really nice ritual to have in your arcane slot.
And in Dungeons and Dragons, there is the spell Haste. It doesn't let you do the same thing a third time, but it does let you take another action, and that other action is limited to a select number of things. So you can take another attack, you can dash, which means you get some extra movement, you can disengage, so you get away from an enemy, you can hide, or you can use an object. Another benefit of Haste in Dungeons and Dragons is that it increases your armor class, which is the number that represents how hard you are to hit. So you're moving so fast that it's harder for enemies to attack you.
Yeah, it's interesting that Haste in Arkham Horror doesn't really have anything to do with evasion or dealing with enemies at all, other than just giving you more actions. But I think the action economy in Arkham Horror kind of plays into this idea of being able to do more than you normally should be able to do in the same amount of time.
And action economy is a lot more important in Arkham Horror than it is in Dungeons and Dragons. So for Dungeons and Dragons, having an extra action really isn't going to get you all that much in the long term, except do more damage probably. But in Arkham Horror, if you have an extra action, that represents a big change in terms of how you're interacting with the game.
33% more turn every turn. Okay. Number 12 is Pathfinder. This is a very simple card. If you are not engaged with any enemies during your turn, you get to just move to a connecting location. That's it.
And when I see Pathfinder in Arkham Horror, it makes me think of the Dungeons and Dragons spell, Find the Path. And Find the Path also has to do with movement, but it doesn't give you more movement, it just helps you find whatever you're looking for. It gives you the shortest, most direct route to a location, and that can be really useful if you are looking for, I don't know, the lost gem of the bad guy you're hunting for.
They couldn't call it Pathfinder in D&D, huh?
Probably not.
Oh.
I think that'd create a little bit of a problem.
Yeah. Next up, number 13, Shielded Faith.
Shield of Faith is a cleric spell or paladin spell, again, usually dealing with these holier classes because you are getting the power of your god to come down and protect either yourself or someone else. So this increases that armor class again, makes it a little bit harder for an enemy to attack you.
In Arkham Horror, the card game, it's pretty much the same idea. You use bless tokens as a shield, basically. So when you get attacked, or anyone gets attacked, you can use the bless tokens that were on your Shield of Faith to just cancel those attacks entirely.
Yes, so Shield of Faith can be really useful again for your squishy wizards because it makes them harder to hit. And similarly with Shield of Faith and Arkham Horror, maybe you don't want another damage on another character or another player, and Shield of Faith will stop that.
It's also a good use of all those bless tokens that maybe Sister Mary or Father Mateo or others might be building up in the bag, since it goes right back into the bag after you take it off of this card.
Oh, that's really nice.
All right, 14 is our second to last one, Scrying.
So this is another divination spell. I think it's interesting that so many divination spells have overlap between Dungeons and Dragons and Arkham. That's probably because these are the information getting spells. So information getting is a big part of Arkham Horror.
Mm-hmm.
This one does have a large material component. It does have a 1,000 gold piece focus. So that's a big resource cost for casting this spell. But once you have that item, you can use it over and over again to look in on other people and what they're doing. It gets harder to look in on someone if you don't know them as well. And if you have something of theirs, then it becomes easier to look on them. And you get information about what they're doing and maybe information about the world.
In Arkham Horror, the card game, there's two versions. There's a level 0 Scrying and level 3 that you see here. It lets you look in on the encounter deck or any investigator's deck to sort of see what's going to be happening soon. It lets you rearrange what those cards are. And there's a little bit of a downside in case you look at a Terror or Omen card. But kind of a similar idea. But of course, in the art here, you don't use a crystal ball or a silver mirror. You're just using tea leaves, I think.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be tea leaves, but I don't see any tea leaves in the picture.
No. It's cool art, though.
So the last one is a spell called Speak with Dead. This is actually a necromancy spell. It's kind of funny in Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of the healing spells, a lot of the cleric spells are necromancy spells. Just a fun little fact. But Speak with Dead allows you to talk to a recently deceased creature. A lot of times the way this works in Dungeons and Dragons is that you're fighting a bunch of humans and you kill them all, but oops, they had some information that you need, and so you cast Speak with Dead to be able to ask them 5 questions about what they knew in life or what information they had.
5 questions.
5 questions.
Okay.
Yes. They don't have to tell you the truth, and a lot of times they will lie, but it's a good way to get some information that you didn't have before.
Okay, in Arkham Horror, there's actually a very new card that none of us have played with quite yet in the upcoming Feast of Hemlock Vale Investigator expansion called Speak to the Dead. And this is kind of an interesting one that has a number of offerings, and you parlay, which means that you can not get attacked by enemies, basically. And you choose a spell or ritual event in your discard pile, and you reveal tokens from the Chaos bag equal to the number of offerings spent. And if you have a skull or curse token that was revealed, it's a little bit of gambling aspect here, you get to return the chosen event to your hand. So this is interacting with the dead in some sense because it's your discard pile. That's often the used cards, of course, but also thematically is like a graveyard, kind of similar to Magic the Gathering in that sense. So that kind of makes it appropriate thematically. The way that they got the parlay in there, I think matches the name pretty well. What about the ability? Does Speak with the Dead kind of do this at all?
It's a similar idea, I think, where you're trying to get information from something that thematically should be inaccessible, or thematically or mechanically inaccessible. So with Speak with Dead, obviously you can't talk to creatures that are dead. You can't, that's just not how the game works. Mm-hmm. But when you cast the spell, now you have that ability. In the Dungeons and Dragons movie, they use this to great effect when they go to a graveyard and talk to some dead bodies.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's sort of true about Mystics in general in Arkham Horror, the card game, that you don't get to take out things from your discard pile very often. So this really is a information that you're not really allowed to get other than just a couple of other cards. So, all right, that's it. That's our list of 15. Some thoughts to sum up our discussion, Samantha?
When we're looking at Dungeons and Dragons spells and Arkham Horror cards, we can see what the games are asking us to do and the ways that we as players can creatively solve problems using these cards. So if you are going into a particular situation as a spellcaster in Dungeons and Dragons, you might want to have certain spells prepared because you think that you're going to encounter situations where it'd be useful to have those spells. It's the same thing in Arkham Horror too, where if you are going into particular campaigns, you want to think about what kinds of cards are going to be helpful for you battling the mythos in those campaigns.
That's true, but I do notice when I went and put together these slides that there's so many spells in D&D, and a lot of the mechanics, of course, in Arkham Horror overlap with each other, right? There's basically evasion, there's investigation, there's fighting, and all of the cards that we saw today have something to do with those. So I think there's sort of a limited amount of creativity that they can do with the cards, whereas in D&D there was so much more that you could talk about on these slides with what these spells were allowing you to do a little bit more creatively because of the flexibility that the campaigns there give you.
Yes, in Dungeons and Dragons, there's a lot more room for players to say, this is what I want to do, and work together with a dungeon master to figure out how that manifests in the mechanics. A lot of times that is just, hey, I want to go climb this tree, and the dungeon master says, cool, roll the die, we'll see how this works with your skills and see if you can actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most common way it happens, but of course it happens with these spells too. So with the divination spells, you cast that spell and your dungeon master and you have to work collaboratively to figure out what kind of information you get from a scry, for example.
Mm-hmm. I think in Arkham Horror, though, we've also chosen, maybe because of the inspiration from D&D, we've chosen a lot of spells that have really nice thematic backgrounds, right? Even just with this last one we looked at, where the card is called Speak to the Dead, I think they've really pushed the theme on this card, not in a bad way, but there's a lot of other cards in the game where you kind of wonder, why is this card called this? The game really requires that you have a lot of cards that fulfill particular needs that the mechanics of the card game wants. These, though, I think really are trying to push the theme in ways that are really good for the game, and I wish that they did more with that. It's not always possible, right? The card game only lets you do certain kinds of things. The mechanics are very constrained. I mean, I happen to like that a lot because I find a lot of creativity in how the designers were able to still tell stories with the mechanics that are in the game. I think there's a lot of emergent narrative that's in Arkham Horror that maybe you have to be a little more creative on your own in D&D, whereas in Arkham Horror you let the story sort of play out through your chaos bag pulls or whatever cards happen to flip on top of off of the top of the encounter deck.
Emergent narrative is definitely part of Dungeons and Dragons. You can say all you want, I want to do this, I want to do that, but if the dice say no, the dice say no. But there is a little bit more room to say, okay, I've encountered a problem and there's multiple ways for me to get out or get around that problem. That just isn't true in Arkham Horror. It's the difference between having a dungeon master who cares about you and wants to have a good time telling a story and the cold, empty universe of the mythos, which makes sense in terms of what stories are often being told with these two games.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it's not just these two games that have spells like Divination and Scrying. What other games do you think of that have some similar abilities to the ones we've seen? Or maybe just what other games have you played that maybe share a similar background and lineage to D&D? And how does that game try to manifest those abilities in maybe a different way? So let us know in the comments. I've also been thinking about this other card game called Slay the Spire, which is kind of a similar idea to Arkham Horror in terms of being a card game, but has a lot of the same names of cards as Arkham Horror, but also in D&D. So if you play Slay the Spire, maybe you have some ideas to share with us in the comments too. Thank you, Samantha, for being with me, and thank you all, of course, for watching as usual. If you enjoy this, we may come back and talk about some other D&D abilities that are similar to Arkham Horror ones, not just spells.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and
We'll see you next time.
yeah.